The title is a bit mysterious. I suppose it pays to be mysterious a little bit in life. You'll have to wait till the end of the lecture until I explain what it means. It's not a very, very funny joke, but anyway, it does have meaning. So thank you all for coming. All of you who've been to some of these lectures, over the last 5 weeks, covered lots of ground and said lots of things. So I hope you're not bamboozled. In this lecture, I just want to bring things to a close, to sum up what I've been saying, and to see where we're at in Buddhist studies, and generally in the West, with our understanding of Buddhism in general. What is happening in the West with regards to how we understand the Buddha's teaching? So let's start with the standard view. The core of Buddhist thought is the teaching of dependent origination, and this is usually understood in two ways. In simple terms, it is read as a doctrine of causality, describing the generation and continuity of suffering. At a deeper level, it is understood to mean that all things, including the self, are comprised by conditioned phenomena, these being insubstantial and impermanent. And these are well described by Walpole Rahula in his famous book, What the Buddha Taught. What we call a being or an individual or I, according to Buddhist philosophy, is only a combination of ever-changing physical and mental forces or energies, which may be divided into 5 groups or aggregates. And also, then he mentioned conditioned genesis, as well as according to the analysis of being into 5 aggregates, the idea of an abiding immortal substance in man or outside, whether it is called Atman, I, soul, self, or ego, is considered only a false belief and mental projection. So that's usually how the philosophy of dependent origination is understood. We're made of impermanent things. These things sort of come into being and form a relationship with other impermanent things, and then they disappear. This sets a clear agenda for the Buddhist meditator. Conditioning, impermanence, and non-self must be understood through calm and insight. So well expressed this idea by Rupert Gethin. The method of developing insight is to direct the perfect mindfulness, stillness, and lucidity that is being cultivated in the jhanas to the contemplation of reality. Reality in the sense of the way things are, or perhaps better, the way things work. This involves watching dhammas, the mental and physical qualities that constitute our experience of the world. The meditator is instructed to watch the rise and fall of dhammas, seeing them as impermanent, suffering, and not self. So this is the standard view of early Buddhism. The key ideas are conditioning, impermanence, and non-self. The key practices are calm and insight. This is, however, a traditional belief. This is exactly what the Theravada tradition says. Why has this not been questioned by modern scholars? Or at least not questioned very much? Historical and philological critique was a major part of the European Enlightenment. It can be taken back to the time when Hobbes and Spinoza began to ask difficult questions about the Bible. The stakes were then extremely high. A modern text critical historian has much less to worry about, and yet the difficult questions have not been asked. We need to question this paradigm. That's what I've been at least trying to do in these lectures. I've also been trying to challenge, I suppose, every point of the standard view. I haven't yet said anything about liberating insight, the processes that lead to it. When a bhikkhu lives diligently and mindfully so that the jhanas develop naturally, how exactly does the process of liberating insight unfold? To understand this, let us remind ourselves of a key aspect of the Buddha's concise instruction in the Madhupindika Sutta. So I mentioned this in the first lecture. Here is an essential segment from that sutta. The source from which conceptual proliferation, apperception, and reckoning afflict a person, if this is not delighted in, or approved of, or clung to, It is here that these evil and skillful phenomena cease without remainder. A very brief statement of what Buddhist awakening consists of. Having a particular attitude to cognition, and therefore somehow there's a transformation. This is a very brief teaching. Now just let me move on then to another Majjhima Nikaya Sutta, the Mahatanha Sankhya Sutta. This explains what is meant in the Madhupindika teaching. So in the Mahatanha Sankhya Sutta, the path given is a simple version of that found in the Samanyapala Sutta. The bhikkhu practices virtue, sense restraint, and mindfulness, wakefulness, before he abandons the 5 hindrances and attains the jhanas. The subsequent account of liberation focuses on the bhikkhu's transformed cognition after the 4th jhana. So the citation below here, this is what happens after the 4th jhana has been attained. The text immediately says, that bhikkhu, having seen a form with the eye, does not become impassioned if the form is attractive, or repulsive if the form is unattractive. He abides with mindfulness of the body established, and with an immeasurable mind. He understands as it really is that release of mind, a release by understanding, in which, for him, all bad, unskillful phenomena cease, without remainder. Letting go of favouring and opposing, whatever sensation he senses, pleasure, pain, or neither pleasure nor pain, he does not delight, approve, or linger clinging to it. So the transformation is sort of complete in the 4th jhana, or at least what goes on after that. The bhikkhu attains the 4th jhana. He abides with mindfulness of the body established. That is in the 4th jhana. That agrees with the 4th jhana definition. I suppose the 4th jhana definition could also be talked of as a sort of immeasurable mind. It's an absorbed state of mind. So this statement here really unpacks what the Buddha has said in the Madhupindika Sutta. We require, according to the Madhupindika Sutta, a different way of experiencing, a different way of cognizing, and here we have it. Last week I talked about the jhanas and the complete psychosomatic transformation that they imagine. That transformation allows experience to work differently. Going back to what I said last week, we can understand that in the 4th jhana, in which this type of experience happens, somehow awareness or sentience has been distributed throughout the body. Cognition has been reduced to its somatic roots. Conceptual proliferation has been stopped. So that is liberating insight. It's the same objects of awareness and a different way of experiencing them. In the Mahatanha Sankhya Sutta, we then, after this description, we get an account of dependent origination in reverse. Experiencing like this means that you don't fall into the same old cycles of clinging, of grasping, and of having desire. So that brings about the cessation of birth, old age, death, sorrow, lamentation, suffering, depression, and tribulation. As the Buddha says, thus is the cessation of this entire mass of suffering. This is how it is brought about. This, I think, is quite different from the standard view. So let us reconsider what the standard view is from this perspective. We must first stress that the standard view is definitely part of the early Buddhist tradition. It is based on ideas and texts contained in the Pali Canon. Already in the Pali Suttas, the theory of karma and insight occupies an important position. But there is also much that is in open and unqualified disagreement with it. Scholars of early Buddhism and Pali have generally ignored this divergence. Not totally, but generally. The texts haven't been taken at their word. Ideas which diverge from the standard view have been ignored. And one aspect of the Pali Suttas has been generalized to the entirety of early Buddhism. Text-critical scholarship, a major achievement of the European Enlightenment, has gone into reverse gear. I say this because we very little questioning work goes on in the study of early Buddhism now. There are more and more scholar monks, and they accept the tradition. Of course, that is absolutely fine. There is nothing wrong with that. But we inherit a particular tradition of text critical history, and that is not being done enough. Let us consider then, put the ideas together what we've been through in these lectures. In Kachana's philosophy of mind, we have identified an understanding of conscience as pre-noetic sentience, in apparent disagreement with the idea of mind assumed in insight meditation. In the Buddha's teachings to Mālunkyaputta, especially, and also Vacchagotta, we have realized there was a different reason for the Buddha's silence. The Buddha wasn't silent just because it made pragmatic sense. The people were asking things not related to the goal. The silence is somehow the answer. The silence indicates that the problem is not the specific items of knowledge, but knowledge itself. In the account of Mālunkyaputa's liberation, we have revealed a bare cognition understanding of mindfulness. And in the Atthaka and Parayana Vaggas, we have discovered that the Buddha had a methodless method approach to spiritual transformation. All of these ideas form a consistent whole. They also agree perfectly well with the main doctrinal formulations of early Buddhism. So the bottom part of this slide, these different ideas, this different interpretation of early Buddhist ideas and thought, I think is in perfect agreement with all the major lists of doctrinal formulations, bar a few, bar a couple. So we have a revised view of early Buddhism. The focus of the five aggregates teaching, and also the doctrine of dependent origination, is not that a person is made up of ever-changing physical and mental forces. Dependent origination instead, as well as the five aggregate doctrine, offer a critique of how knowledge is formed. The point is epistemological rather than ontological. Soteriology in the Siddhantas also is on the whole not a form of karma and insight. Mindfulness is rather a simplification of cognition, and the four jhanas are not concentrative practices. So let me sum these ideas here. Dependent origination is originally a metaphysical critique of knowledge. Mindfulness is a simplification of cognition to destruct knowledge or view formation. Absorption in the form of the four jhanas, they are a natural process of psychosomatic transformation, allowing sentience to be suffused or distributed back to its somatic roots. Liberating insight, finally we've seen today in the Madhupindika Sutta, is a non-conceptual awareness of the way things really are. The standard view emerged from the creative ferment of the early Buddhist period. Versions of it dominated Theravada Buddhism in South Asia, probably I would say from at least the Ashokan period onwards. As for the Mahasangika wing of the Sangha, I'm not so sure. At least with the Theravadins, the calm insight paradigm is there in place, and the no-self doctrine is there by the time of Ashoka. But there was also a comprehensive Buddhist philosophy earlier than this, consisting of a philosophy of mind and meditation as well as a soteriology. It seems that this understanding was interpreted away, adapted to the new end of karma and insight, and much more. How exactly did this happen? We do not know the answer to this exactly. But there are good reasons for thinking an influx of non-Buddhist ideas and practices distorted the earlier clarity of the Buddha's teachings. To be precise, practices related to the Buddha's teachers were taken over. Despite the Buddha's rejection of them, formless meditation was Buddhicized. In the accounts of the Buddha's striving, the goals of pre-Buddhist meditation are said to lead only to certain types of arising in the world, in the sphere of nothingness and neither perception nor non-perception. So the critique was of ends, of where the practices lead up. It wasn't a critique of means. This opened up the possibility that these absorptions could be practiced. So concentration made its way into the early Sangha. Meditative concentration, the aim of shutting down sense perception, is connected to Brahmin ascetics in the Pali Suttas. In the dialogue with the young Brahmin Uttara, in the Indriya Bhavana Sutta, the Buddha criticizes the meditative goal of Uttara's teacher. Uttara's teacher is the Brahmin Parasarya. The name is actually testified in the Moksha Dharma in the Mahabharata in a Sanskritized form. I'm not sure what the connection might be, though. This teaching is that, so the Buddha says of this teaching that by not seeing with the eye or hearing with the ear, one might as well be blind or deaf. In his discussion with the Brahmin Upasiva in the Parayana Vagga, the Buddha is specifically asked about an object of meditative concentration. A Brahmin said to be a meditator asks the Buddha about meditative concentration. He wants an object to concentrate on. He wants a practice. The Buddha instead focuses his reply on the teaching of mindfulness. This is an important connection, the connection with early Brahmanism. It's important because some of the ideas and practices of meditative concentration are described throughout the early Upanishads. Some of this literature predates the Buddha, some is contemporaneous with early Buddhism, and some of it is later. But early Buddhists were probably influenced by this stream of thought. Let me give one very clear example, I think. This is the idea of nirvana with or without a remnant of material substratum. This is a standard view of Buddhism, two types of nirvanas. Nirvana when you're alive and the arahant lives, and what happens when the arahant dies? The arahant enters the final nirvana. So this is nirvana with a remnant of material substratum, nirvana without a remnant of material substratum. So this Itivuttaka teaching makes it very clear. The arahant, when he is living, he has abandoned greed, hate, and delusion. That's nirvana in life. With a remnant of material, with a material substratum, you have a body. When you die and the body is burnt, that is final nirvana. This idea of two types of liberation is strangely standard in the early Upanishads. First of all, in the meditative teachings of early Brahmanism, they say you see the self. That's a vision you have in life. You gain that through meditation. But at death, when you lose the body, that's when you really get liberated. Without the body, you can merge into Brahman for good, once and for all. So this idea is a sort of Buddhist version of what you get in the Upanishads. But this idea is also denied outright in the Atthakavagga. So I have here just a question put to the Buddha at the end of the Kalaha Vivada Sutta. We don't know who the Buddha's questioner is. But whenever seekers are mentioned in the Atthakavagga and the Parayana Vagga, the seekers are Brahmins. So I think we can assume that this is put by a Brahmin thinker. A Brahmin seeker is asking the Buddha this question. Verse 882 of the Kalaha Vivada Sutta. Indeed, some wise men say that just this much is the purity of a yaka, here, in this world. But some among them, claiming to be wise, say there is a time when there is no remnant of material substratum. So this is at the end of this dialogue of the Kalaha Vivada Sutta. The Buddha is asked, okay, you're talking about liberation in the here and now, but other people say it differently. They say there's a time when someone achieves final liberation, liberation without material substratum, liberation at death. So in response to this, If the Buddha had thought this idea from the Itivuttaka, he should respond like that. But he doesn't. He denies the distinction. In fact, he critiques them. He sort of analyzes it away. He says, understanding these as dependent, the sage, having understood, investigates dependency. Having then understood, he is released and does not get involved in dispute. The wise one does not associate with being and non-being. Another profound statement of the Atthakavagga. I think the last half of it, the Buddha is talking about himself. He's saying, don't draw me into this. I've gone beyond it. But the Buddha's point is at least clear by what he says at the end of this answer. He talks about the sage not associating with being or non-being. He talks also about the ideas of two nirvana, the idea of two types of nirvana being dependent. What he means is that these ideas are dependent on the ideas of existence and non-existence. The sage investigates the dependency of these ideas, and he doesn't fall into them. This perspective agrees with pretty much everything we've been saying in these lectures. So how do we explain the idea of two nirvanas? If we accept the Buddha or early Buddhism is represented by this Kalahavivada statement, then the Itivuttaka statement must be a later addition, a later development. So this idea of two nirvanas, it's also illustrated in the Buddha's text. Amazingly, it is illustrated with the metaphor of rivers running into the sea. There couldn't be a clearer Brahminic metaphor. It's used in the Upanishads, I think in the Mundaka Upanishad, to explain how liberated souls are absorbed into Brahman. I think the only way to understand this divergence is to say that different things were thought in early Buddhism, and there was a development in ideas. Probably there were some early Buddhists who were influenced by the meditative ideals of the Upanishads. Upanishadic circles, I'm not saying that they had some book in their hand was the Upanishads. Upanishadic ideas were circulating, accepted by certain brahmanas, probably who were paribhajikas, wanderers. What else might they have borrowed? Let's return to the Sudattaka Sutta of the Atthakavagga and the Buddha's statement that cognizing an object is the antithesis of liberation. I mentioned this, I think, in the second or third lecture. I'm mentioning it again because here we have another massive divergence in thought. If a man's purification occurs through what is seen, or one abandons suffering through knowledge, being purified by another, one has a conceptual foundation. A person's view proclaims him as he speaks thus. There couldn't be more of a disagreement with standard Theravada, the standard Theravada position. Completely different from this. But this is a real, very ancient Buddhist teaching. So, we suspect early Buddhism was sort of changed by the encounter with early Upanishadic Brahmanism. Might the difference between the Sudattaka statement, this piece of wisdom, and the standard statement, we hear this, see the citation from Rupa Gethin again, might this also be due to the Upanishadic influence? It's a strange thing to think about, but I mean, the Upanishads are so focused on the self and seeing the self, but they essentially have the same model of spirituality, of calm and insight. So in this citation from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, that this is coming after a teaching on the self. So the thing that is being understood is the Atman, the self. But the model of calm and insight is here. Therefore, knowing this teaching, having become calm, tamed, quiet, patient and absorbed, he sees the self in the self. He sees the self as everything. This idea is developed throughout the early Brahminic texts on yoga. Inner absorption is the necessary precursor to liberating insight. Of course, the liberating insight has a different object. It's the Atman, the Upanishadic self. But the theoretical framework is identical to karma and insight. Karma and insight is denied outright in the Atthakavagga. It's accepted in the Upanishads. So where is the standard Buddhist position coming from? The Upanishads or the Atthakavagga? On this slide, the statement of Rupa Gethin, to which other statement is it closest? I would say it's closest to the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. Just change the object of liberating insight, you have Theravada Buddhism. You can't say the same about the Sudattaka Sutta. It's saying something completely different. I think what do we try to do here? We try to get the best possible interpretation of the evidence that we have. And it seems to me the Buddhist theory of karma and insight was initially unknown, denied outright in the Atthakavagga, but was then taken over from an Upanishadic source. Let's state the non-Buddhist ideas which distorted the Buddha's teachings as follows. Here are the key ideas. So here are the neo-Upanishadic ideas as they became Buddhicized. So first, meditation as inner concentration, yoga. Initially, Buddhists didn't use that word. They were resistant to using that word. It's the standard Brahminic word, but they did succumb eventually. Buddhist meditation in the Pali Canon is not yoga. They just don't even use the term. Next then, the idea of insight as a mystical vision, achieved when the mind has been sufficiently stilled through yoga. Nirvana as a non-temporal dimension outside the world, beyond dukkha. The world of samsara, this Buddhist cosmology, you have samsara, you have continuity through rebirths. And then you have nirvana. Nirvana as an unconditioned dimension. Related to that, then, you have a distinction between two types of liberation. Nirvana anticipated in life, through insight, and then finally the entry into nirvana at death. That's standard Theravada Buddhism. It's also probably standard Indian Buddhism, at least through the Theravada school of South Asia and all its different sub-schools. I think it probably applies pretty much to any Mahasanghika tradition as well. But these ideas don't really make sense of an abundance of teachings that we've looked at in these lectures. These include meditation as mindfulness, which means bare cognition. Jhana as a psychosomatic transformation of the entire human being. Nirvana as the cessation of thirst. And of course, the Buddha doesn't draw a distinction between nirvana in life or beyond it. So if you ask the Buddha, what's different between a liberated person who's alive and dead, he either denies the question or analyzes it away, or he just stays silent. It's not what the Buddha teaches about. The influx of non-Buddhist ideas and the subsequent emergence of Buddhicized versions of Upanishadic thought left the early Buddhist community with a serious problem. On the one hand, the Buddha had adopted a critical attitude to the notion of self. On the other, Buddhists were practicing Upanishadic type absorptions and imagining their practices in Upanishadic terms. So how to square the not-self teachings with Upanishadic substantialism? The obvious solution was to reject the Upanishadic self at the same time as accepting some Upanishadic ideas about the mind or consciousness. In the early Upanishads, there is a general reification of the subject of experience. The subject who experiences is reified into a real thing called mind or consciousness. Some Buddhists seem to have been influenced by this essentialism because they began to speak of mind or consciousness as the subject of perception, and hence the subject of liberation. Who experiences liberation? If you have to ask that question, you can't say it's a self if you're a Buddhist, but you might say it's just the mind. It's a good way to get out of it. So we can see this in the Vinaya Mahavagga account of the liberation of the first 5 bhikkhus. So this is coming after not-self teachings have been given. But okay, so the not-self teachings have been given. The bhikkhus present have heard these new profound ideas. The text then says, the Blessed One said this. Delighted, the group of 5 bhikkhus rejoiced in what the Blessed One said. When the discourse was being given, the minds of the 5 bhikkhus, the group of 5 bhikkhus, were released from the corruptions without clinging. At that time, there were 6 arahants in the world. So why not speak about the bhikkhus gaining liberation? Why not just use conventional language like early Buddhist texts do? The Buddha attained enlightenment. Bhikkhus attain enlightenment. Why do we have this idea of the minds? Why do we have to specify? Let's suppose that this is significant. Now, I might be reading too much into this, you might think. This is just a manner of speaking. You know, we cannot hold religious people to strict philosophical standards. But let's just say that this means what it says, and they put it like this for a reason. Why did they put it like this? I think we can imagine 2 important factors behind the wish to elide the bhikkhu from accounts of liberation. Sorry. First, there is the Buddha's critical attitude to the self. This inclined early Buddhists to believe in no self. Now, the Buddha didn't say there is no self. He just critiqued the idea of a self. There's an important distinction. The Buddha doesn't make ontological statements. He just critiques your ideas, your states of mind, and asks you to really think, can you draw your conclusions that you have from your experience? Anyway, early Buddhists definitely started to think there is no self. So attempts were made to use language more precisely. Attempts were made to avoid implying that there is a place for a person in the metaphysics of awakening. That's one reason, I think, why early Buddhists would start writing things like this. Chanting, I suppose I should say. There's another reason. If you imagine liberation in terms of insight into an object, you require not just an object of liberation, but also a subject which perceives it. So the calm insight idea, let's say it's come from the Upanishads, that requires a subject of cognition in some essential sense. There is a real object being really understood. What is perceiving that? You're logically required to fill that gap in. So the solution to these 2 concerns, the no-self concern and the insight meditation concern, is very simple. You just use the mind. You just say that the mind is the subject of the liberating experience. You think of something like this. Okay, you probably still don't believe me. I'm going to try and prove now that I'm right through philological argument. Right, now there's a big, major Pali problem in most of the Pali Sutta accounts of the mind being the subject of liberation. Now, one of the major patterns I put up here is the pattern that occurs after the not-self teaching has been given. So the pattern, this is what the texts say when... Right, there shouldn't be a gap in... This is all one statement, sorry. This is what the texts say after the not-self teaching. Seeing thus, the learned disciple of the noble becomes disillusioned with form, sensation, apperception, volitions, and consciousness. Being disillusioned, he becomes dispassionate. Through dispassion, he is released. When it is released, there is the knowledge it is released. And he understands. Birth is exhausted, the holy life has been lived. Done is what had to be done, nothing more is required for the state thus. So we have a problem which I think is both literary, philosophical, and philological. First of all, the literary aspect. We have a narrative of the bhikkhu's liberation, which is disturbed by this statement in bold. So you see the sections of this text underlined are quite happy to speak about the bhikkhu in conventional terms attaining liberation. But then we switch to this different type of statement which cannot refer to the bhikkhu. It's using the neuter gender. It has to refer to the bhikkhu's mind. It's a peculiar statement, but it has to refer to the mind. So from a literary analysis perspective, we move from conventionally speaking about the bhikkhu to ultimately speaking about his mind, back to conventionally speaking about the bhikkhu. Okay, that's one thing. The next thing then, this grammar of this statement. Here is the Pali statement. I'm sorry for those of you who don't know Pali now. This Pali statement is very strange. It's a very strange statement. It is using a quote and using the word iti to make a direct quote. These quotes can be used to give what people say, what people think, or a reason. Now, the problem is that the quotes never usually appear with this form iti. That's not the regular Pali. The regular Pali will be vimuttanti. You do get iti used as a word. When it's used as a word, it doesn't get used like this as the quotation mark. It starts a statement and points forward about some teaching. Thus the Buddha teaches something. Thus the bhikkhu does something. Read thousands of pages of Pali Sutta material. You don't get iti used like this. Now the solution seems to be pretty simple. There is a different variation of this short formula. Instead of having vimuttam iti, we have a variant which is vimuttam hiti. Vimuttam iti, vimuttam hiti. It's almost the same. But the variant means there is the knowledge, I am released. That fits the literary analysis as well. If we go with the variant is simply saying the learned disciple of the noble becomes disillusioned. He becomes dispassionate. Through dispassion he is released. When he is released, he knows I am released. That works well. But you can see why no self-theorist wouldn't like that. And it's very easy to change this to a non-regular Pali form. So anyway, this is an argument that ideas, texts were changed to fit a particular agenda. According to the philosophy of Buddhist meditation reconstructed here, there is no place for an essential mind as a subject of liberation. Indeed, an essential subject of liberation is avoided in Kachana's philosophy, where consciousness is imagined as a process of construction and conceptualization. Of course, the early teachings are often critical of the idea of self, or of any possible identifications with the five aggregates. Where do we go from here? This is typical Theravada reductionism. What I want to say, though, that we have to moderate this understanding. We moderate it by, first of all, we cannot deny the Buddha is critical of the self. Here is a statement from the Atthakavagga, where the Buddha states, the root of conceptual proliferation and reckoning, the thought I am, the stage should stop completely. Whatever thirst there is internally, by dispelling those, one should train ever mindful. Standard type of teaching from the Atthakavagga and a standard Buddhist critique of the self. The thought I am is the problem. You cannot get more Buddhist than that. So the experience of nirvana must be selfless. On the other hand, early Buddhist texts speak of the bhikkhu as the person who experiences liberation. Despite reductionistic efforts to identify mind as the subject, the account of the jhanas say that the transformation occurs in the person as a whole. I mean, the jhana similes, they say that the transformation occurs as a whole. They couldn't put it any other way. Through the jhanas, through the meditative states of the jhanas, consciousness is deconstructed to a type of pre-noetic sentience suffused throughout the body. So it is the sentient Kadava, the person of a whole, that experiences liberation, not an essential part of him which functions as a knower. Here is this statement of the Brahmajala Sutta that I mentioned in the first lecture. We started with this statement. Very strange statement. The body of the Tathagata remains. Its connection with being has been severed. The Buddha is talking about his awakened state as an embodied state, not just saying that the body is part of the state. It cannot be reduced from the state. So I think we shouldn't just speak of the bhikkhu as the subject of religious experience in a purely conventional sense. The bhikkhu as a person is the subject of liberation. Obviously, it is not the bhikkhu of such a name, such a personal history, who has the nirvana experience, but it is still the person in some ineffable, mysterious way. So I think what I want to say is the category of the person, it's not just a linguistic convention when it comes to the epistemology of nirvana. It's sort of required as an experiential fact. Nirvana is both selfless as well as something experienced by the person as a whole. So perhaps we should use Stephen Collins' famous expression, selfless persons, but take both words seriously, assigning equal importance to both. Although nirvana is selfless, it is the whole person who is transformed. That, anyway, few remarks to make about the understanding of Buddhism. Now, one of the other things I mentioned at the beginning of the lectures is, does this make sense? Now, of course, this is not really something which is on the agenda for science. There is no science, well, I don't really know, I can't make this statement. I don't think there is any real science of the person as a whole. Certainly there's a science that is reductionistic, and especially neuroscience reduces the person to sort of neural networks and processes. So this is not something, what I'm saying, which will agree with science. Scientists will disagree with this. You have a lot of scientists and philosophers writing books about Buddhism from a secularized and naturalized perspective now. It's quite curious if you read these books, you know, that it's persons who are thinking through these ideas, persons writing the books, persons feeling obvious satisfaction in writing the books, persons gaining individual benefits from the ideas and therapeutic practices. So the person is assumed at every step of the journey, even though the major theoretical commitment is to the absence of a person. So I think there's something not exactly wrong with science. Science does what it does in a reductionistic sense. That is perfectly fine. But human beings are about a bit more than what science can comprehend. Even if we put these to one side, these observations, are naturalists, secular Buddhists, are they drawing the right conclusions from their scientific theories? Perhaps the most important secularist commitment is the Darwinian idea of evolution through natural selection. But I think even here we have reasons to believe, the secularists are not getting it right. In a useful contribution, Johannes Bronkhorst has argued that the theory of evolution through natural selection makes sense of the idea of religious experience. His analysis depends on the fact that the human faculty of symbolic representation has been enabled through a linguistic ability acquired through natural selection. The result of natural selection is that the symbols of language have interposed between us and the world. That's what happens. We acquire languages. We stop being apes, we acquire languages, a language, we build up concepts. The concepts interfere between our relationship that we have with the world. That's the human condition. But Bronkhorst takes seriously the idea, the reports of the experiences of mystics, madmen, and meditators, which suggests that the web of concepts is sometimes torn, whether on purpose or by accident. Might this describe the Buddha's awakening? Did the Buddha experience a state in which the symbolic or linguistic nature of cognition ceased to function? So Bronkhorst imagines what such an experience is like in these words. Such a person may be expected to experience the world differently and in a more direct and immediate fashion, since ordinary human experience is always separated from its objects by the web of symbolic representation. The claim that mystical experience gives access to a different and higher reality is, though not strictly true, almost correct. Experience through symbolic representation is indirect, immediate. Experience without it, or with less of it, is direct, immediate. Strictly speaking, it is the same objective reality, that is experience, but it is experienced so differently that the experiencer may have difficulty recognizing it. This is a purely naturalistic way of interpreting mystical or religious experience. Of course, he is saying that although mystics don't actually experience a spiritual or sacred reality, they can be forgiven for thinking that they do. So Bronkhorst goes on, the subject, as a result of mystical experience, is easily convinced that he or she is confronted with a different reality, where in actual fact it is the same reality that is experienced differently. The mystical experience is so much more direct and undoubtedly real that the choice is obvious. The reality presumably experienced in the mystical state is more real than that of ordinary experience. So a mystic can be forgiven for taking a non-verbal, non-symbolic experience as if it relates to a higher level of reality. It is indeed a kind of direct contact with reality as it is, not reality as it is labeled or conceptualized. As to the cultivation of this type of experience, Bronkhorst explains, how does one stop innumerable associations, most of which are not even conscious? Focusing the mind presents itself as a plausible method. The faculty is to some extent, the mind, the faculty of thinking, subject to ordinary conscious control. We then speak of concentration. So there are perfectly good scientific reasons for thinking that there is more to mysticism than what we might initially think. Mysticism can be naturalized, you could say. Perhaps Buddhism could be naturalized like this. And we should take this idea seriously, given the natural selection of language. On the other hand, is Buddhism just a philosophically sophisticated form of mysticism? In a naturalized form? Is it really that? Maybe if you look at some statements of the Buddha, it does give this impression. So this citation from the Mahanidana Sutta focuses explicitly on the problems of language. Language is that which is transcended. So the Buddha is here talking about the extent of terminology, language, designation, understanding. The word is actually panya. And he talks of the bhikkhu released from that through insight, anya. That sounds pretty much sort of that it would fit Bronkhorst's theory. But then the Buddha goes on in very characteristic style to say that this person cannot be designated. We cannot find the appropriate words to fit this person. And it's at this point that the Buddha is sort of going beyond what we can imagine in terms of mysticism. So I'm saying it with the final part of this sutta is a point of this statement is a point I'm going to start to build upon now. I don't think Buddhism can just be explained as a type of mysticism, whether you take mysticism as a natural or spiritual meaning. Let us consider the Buddha, as a bodhisattva, rejected the mysticism of his teachers. Having apparently tried out and become adept in altered states of consciousness, he found them wanting. Absorption, concentration, as a temporary suspension of linguistic abilities, was apparently rejected by the Buddha. The Buddha fashioned a solution to suffering involving much more than being released from the net of language. He actually uses that expression in the Brahmajala Sutta. Brahmajala can mean that, but he claimed much more. We have seen the text on the jhanas imagine a psychosomatic transformation. This transformation, of course, goes beyond science as we know it. The Buddha is imagining states and processes about which science knows nothing. So how do we view awakening? Is awakening a religious or purely therapeutic state? Unfortunately, the early Buddhists were reluctant to say very much about this. Here we have a dialogue between Mahakotthita and Sariputta in the Anguttara Nikaya. We find here this encapsulates the early Buddhist problem with talking about ultimate reality. We're talking about nirvana here. Mahakotthita says to Sariputta, "Venerable Sir, with the fading away and cessation, without remainder of the 6 bases of contact, is there anything else? Do not speak thus, sir," says Sariputta. That question, by the way, is a question about experience of a living person. If we are talking about death, the vocabulary, the ideas would be entirely different. We're talking about a meditative state in which cognition has been transformed or is different. So Sariputta says, "Do not speak thus, sir." Now then, Kotthita goes on to ask, that question, that final bit of the question, is there anything else? He goes on to say, well, is there nothing? Is there both nothing and something? Is there neither nothing nor something? And of course, in each case, Sariputta says, "Do not speak thus, sir." When asked for an explanation, Sariputta says this: when one affirms with the fading away and cessation without remainder of the 6 bases of contact, there is something else. One conceptually proliferates that which is without conceptual proliferation. The extent to which, sir, the 6 bases of contact function, to that extent conceptual proliferation functions. The extent to which conceptual proliferation functions, to that extent the 6 bases of contact function. With the fading away and cessation without remainder of the 6 sense bases, conceptual proliferation ceases. Conceptual proliferation is calmed. So we cannot say anything about it. And Buddhism, early Buddhism, is very strict in drawing the line there. The Buddha and his followers stop here. Language has limits. This is unfortunate for us. We want to know if Buddhism is about more than purely therapy. We're not really being told here. But the Buddha does say things which are a little bit more revealing and a little bit more shocking, actually. Here are a couple of shocking statements of the Buddha. So first of all, in his dialogue with the Brahmin Udaya, the Buddha is asked in the Parayanavagga, how does consciousness cease for the person who wanders mindfully? We have come to question the Blessed One and will listen to your teaching. The Buddha's answer, internally and externally, not delighting in sensation, consciousness ceases for the one who wanders thus mindful. So, consciousness ceases in a state of mindfulness. Try to get your head around that. But I think at least the Buddha is saying that transformation is about a bit more than just language. Consciousness ceases, whatever we mean by that. So the Buddhist transformation, Buddhist awakening, involves a bit more than just language and symbols, our use of symbols. It is about cognition in general, and apparently essential aspects of it. The Buddha, let us look at another statement of the Buddha which goes even further. In the Kalahavivada Sutta, the Buddha is asked this question. The agreeable and disagreeable depend upon what? When what is not, do they not occur? And this matter of being and non-being, tell this to me, on what they depend. The agreeable and disagreeable, the Buddha says, depend on contact. When contact is not, they do not occur. And this matter of being and non-being, it depends on this, I say. The Buddha here seems to imply that our world of things, of existence and non-existence, is dependent on contact. In other words, the usual way we cognize things brings things into existence. Existence and non-existence don't exist outside of our cognition. Does this mean that the world is just a mental construct, a product of conceptual proliferation? Well, this is not the Theravada position, obviously, but it's implied in quite a number of early Buddhist texts. The idea is given a very sophisticated treatment by Nagarjuna. So there is a deep, profound, anti-realist strain within the early Buddhist teachings. And I think only this can make sense of another one of these enigmatic statements that I mentioned in the first lecture. The Buddha states in the Sangyutta and a few other places, I declare that the world, its arising, cessation, and the way thereto occurs in this very fathom-long corpse, cadaver, endowed with perception and mind. We have here the statement that the world of experience is dependent on a person's cognitive apparatus, not on the mind. We've seen that there is no mind-body dualism in early Buddhism. It's on the cognizing, sentient being in general. So we seem to have uncovered, finally, an original and radical Buddhist philosophy of mind and meditation. This philosophy is clearly stated, I would claim, in numerous early texts. Why has it hardly been noticed? Why has the general consensus stuck rigidly to the theory of calm and insight? A curious feature of the Pali Canon makes this question even more problematic. The opening suttas of the Digha, Majjhima, and Sangyutta Nikayas, and even of the Sutta Nipata, explicitly state the philosophy of mind and meditation we have studied here. First suttas, you open the Pali text, the first suttas you get the ideas I'm talking about. So in the Majjhima Nikaya, in the Mula Pariyaya Sutta, we have a distinction between ordinary cognition and cognition of an arahant. An ordinary person conceives and thinks about objects, but an arahant does not. An ordinary person might perceive and think about earth, an object, matter. The arahant does not do that. That's very clear, I think. In the Sangyutta Nikaya, a little bit more tricky, in the Ogatarana Sutta, we have a statement of what I've been calling the methodless method of the Buddha. So this is the opening sutta of the Sangyutta. A deity comes to the Buddha when he's in Savatthi and asks this, how did you, respected sir, cross the flood? By not standing still, sir, and not struggling, I crossed over the flood. And you're like, no idea what that means. The Buddha then says, when, sir, I settled down, I sank, but when I struggled, I was carried away. Thus, sir, without standing still or struggling, I crossed the flood. That is, this is poetry, this is verse, these ideas are beautiful, but still, it's not coming from a calm insight perspective. If you neither make an effort nor stand still, what can you actually do? Only mindfulness understood as bare cognition makes any sense. The bhikkhu can carefully tend to his cognition without living negligently or intentionally directing it. In this sense, he could indeed be said to neither stand still nor struggle. So that's the Sangyutta. Finally, then, in the Sutta Nipata, the Uraga Sutta, verses 8 to 9 of the first Sutta of the Sutta Nipata. The one who neither oversteps nor lags behind, by going beyond all this conceptual proliferation, that bhikkhu abandons the near and far shore, like a snake abandons its old decrepit skin. The one who neither oversteps nor lags behind, having realized that all this is unreal, that bhikkhu abandons the near and far shore, like a snake abandons its old decrepit skin. This is a very old, there's a few reasons for considering this old, but we have it stated very clearly. The bhikkhu realizes that all this is unreal. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, in the Digha Nikaya, the Brahmajala Sutta states the doctrine of epistemological conditioning in emphatic form. It rigorously lists 62 views as a framework to represent all view. It does this so it can critique the very possibility of view, how view is formed. So this is a text critiquing, from the perspective of dependent origination, how knowledge arises. A key part of the analysis reads as follows. Therein, bhikkhus, whatever ascetics or Brahmins, make all sorts of claims with reference to the past and future. This is because what is sensed by these venerable ascetics and Brahmins, who have no knowledge and vision and are affected by thirst, what is sensed by them is subjected to trembling and quivering. These terms, trembling and quivering, don't mean that the ascetics and Brahmins are cold. They're not trembling in the winter. It's their minds we're talking about. And I don't think we could have a clearer expression of cognitive malfunctioning. Every single modern English translation of the Brahmajala Sutta has got this point wrong. Now, Bhikkhu Bodhi has done lots of wonderful work, and his translations are indispensable. But he gets it wrong in his translation here. He says, this is the people who assert views. That is only the feeling of those who do not know and see. That is only the agitation and vacillation of those who are immersed in craving. This translation is grammatically and logically impossible. Views are not feelings. Both in Pali and in English. You cannot say that views are the feeling of somebody in Pali. Buddhist thinkers are more precise than that. The views are also, they're not vacillations. That's completely the wrong term. A vacillation is some form of indecision. It's the wrong word. The Pali text also does not say that the recluses and Brahmins have feelings. It's talking about how cognition is acted upon, how cognition is constructed. So I'm just pointing this out, not to critique Bhikkhu Bodhi in particular, because he has, I don't know where we would be in Pali studies without him. But this is the first sutra of the Brahmajala, this is the first sutra of the Digha Nikaya. It's stating very clearly this very old piece of Buddhist wisdom, and we're not getting it right. Right, I come to what I mean by the gateway. I'm sorry for running over time. The gateway is simply this. The opening suttas of the Digha, Majjhima, and Sangyutta Nikayas and the Sutta Nipata state very clearly the key ideas of Buddhist philosophy according to our analysis. They state that arahants do not apperceive, conceptualize, or even think. They state that view or knowledge is a construct based on a particular way that cognition works. They state that the world of ordinary experience is somehow an unreal conceptual construction. The way things are is nothing like what we imagine. They also say that liberation requires a methodless method, whereby one neither endeavors nor stands still. Could the correct interpretation of early Buddhism be much more obvious than this? The gateway to the Buddha's teachings, understanding the Buddha's teachings, is right there in front of our eyes. As soon as we open the Sutta Pitaka, this gateway opens up a quiet and secluded path to a cool forest grove which contains treasures not long neglected or misinterpreted. The scholarship on Pali and early Buddhism has long been led up the garden path, directed away from the gateway and into the impressive palatial buildings of monastic Buddhism. But this tradition, despite its brilliant achievements in civilization, it received not only the teachings of the Buddha, it also received the teachings of his successors, who were influenced by the weight of Upanishadic thought. Text-critical scholarship can and should go beyond this. After all, we are the heirs of Spinoza and the European Enlightenment, not Edward Said. The ideas of the Buddha are far too important not to be treated to a thorough analysis. So it is now time to step back through the gateway and into the speculative world of the early Buddhist tradition.